given all the colonial
That's true, and we'll talk about some of the ways in which there were attempts to try and get rid of some of these groups. Don't forget paper due today, but also you have the opportunity of going back and completing any assignments. Talking with Emily before class, spring break will technically start Sunday evening, right? So anything up through Sunday evening, I'll accept and grade. So if you have any quizzes hanging out there that you haven't finished, if there's any papers that you haven't finished, the video assignment from back during lectureship week, make sure to complete those by Sunday evening. When it comes to the issue of colonialism, a lot of the way peoples understood what they were doing was wrapped up in religion. And so the Western powers, right, France, Britain, the Dutch, etc., thought about their missions as God-given missions, and that God had intended for them not only to conquer people, but to share the truth of Christianity. And a lot of the ways they interpreted their success was based on the belief that, well, Christianity was true, that's why we succeeded. But for natives, the indigenous peoples experiencing a lot of the violence of colonialism, it often became a moment of trauma religiously because the gods, the spirits, the ancestors, whatever, had kind of let them down. Sometimes the Westerners were understood as divine beings. Sometimes Westerners were understood as punishment from divine beings. So all of this was wrapped up in religious types of connotations. What I want to do is go over the same regions we talked about on Tuesday, Africa, the Native America, and Australia, and look at some ways some of these people responded religiously. Now, European colonization of Africa was different than what happened in the Americas and Australia. In Australia and the Americas, European communities intentionally went to those places to resettle. And so they were going to the Americas for taking the land, colonizing, etc. In those places, European diseases ravaged the populations, right? If you remember about the things that caused smallpox among the Native Americans. But other things like pneumonia, measles, tuberculosis also had damaging effect on indigenous populations as well. In Africa, however, it was different. Africa for colonizers was about taking people from Africa to the Americas as slaves. And in Africa, it was often the Europeans that fell plague to diseases like malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. And so it was the Europeans that ended up having a lot of problems. In some cases, Africans converted to Christianity, although the highest number of conversions occurred in the Americas among the slave population. Others responded to colonialism and the religious crisis by reconceptualizing religious understandings of the world. The example that I want to use here is the example of the Hosha people in southern Africa. Again, this isn't necessarily representative of all African tribes or all the ways Africans responded to colonization, but they do provide us a good example of seeing how here is a religious answer to what's occurring. The Hosha were cattle breeders, but they were very nomadic. They didn't stay in any particular place. But by the 19th century, their lands had been taken over by the British through a variety of military defeats. In 1856, a young Hosha woman named Nungakusi had a vision. She was told that the British had succeeded because the Hosha had disappointed the gods. And so they had kind of let the gods down, which is why the gods allowed the British to take their place, or to take their land. They hadn't been keeping up with the sacrifices, they weren't living good with respect to morality, and had even turned to witchcraft. And so not only is this prophecy about this is why this has happened, but she also shared with the people about what would be necessary to change things. The gods, according to Namaphusa, demanded a massive sacrifice. And so the ancestors, the gods, wanted the people to destroy the rest of their remaining cattle. Hence, getting the name, the cattle-killing movement. Again, not something that they would have talked about, but as far as something scholars use to talk about. So if they destroy the remaining cattle, she tells them, the Europeans will disappear. The ancestors will come back from the dead, and they will have even greater prosperity than what they had before the British showed up. And so she said on February 16, 1857, the sun would turn red, the land would be purified, and the British would be pushed into the sea. And a lot of people bought into this, and so they killed their cattle, they burnt their granaries down. As you can kind of already expect, the British weren't pushed into the sea, and it actually kind of, what they've created here is famine. But then also, because they've created famine, they become more dependent on the British because they need the British for food and some other things. And so resistance among the Hosha to colonialism essentially ended. And many of the people converted to Christianity. Yeah, and this idea of that the gods would rise up and cast the invaders into the sea is one that we see in a variety of places. But essentially what we have here is this religious response to colonialism. It's an entirely new one. Entirely new based on this prophecy. Any questions about the cattle-killing movement? Let's turn then to Native America. Again, we're just kind of doing brief overviews. And before we get to a specific movement, I want to talk a little bit about developments among Native American cultures during this time. Europeans, of course, came into contact with Native Americans at least by the 15th century. There are some indications that there were Europeans that had traveled to the Americas prior to this, but at least by the end of the 15th century, we know that colonization, contact is occurring in greater and greater numbers. But a lot of changes happened, especially in thinking about the United States. We're talking about Native North Americans. One aspect of that was very important in these changes was policy of removal. So from the 1820s to the 1840s, essentially the federal government's policy was to engineer the removal of Native Americans from their traditional tribal lands on the eastern coast to past the Mississippi. Those areas became known as Indian Territory. So we're largely thinking about places like Arkansas, Oklahoma, places that have large Indian populations today. But it also included places like Kansas and Nebraska as well. Essentially, what was given here was the power to take their lands, but also use the military to enforce their removal. In some cases, it caused a division of tribes, as some tribes still had some people present in their traditional lands while others were removed. And so, for example, today there are Seminoles still in Florida, but then there is a Seminole tribe in Oklahoma as well. The same kind of thing with the Creek, known as Muskogee, in Oklahoma. Another part of this process of changing the conditions of Native Americans was the development of reservations. Essentially setting up these holding areas bounded by treaties or other sorts of legal institutions where Native Americans were not allowed essentially to kind of roam free as they had been, but that they were required to remain in certain places based on the tribes and the federal policy. The belief was by the federal government that by holding people in reservations, they would be Americanized quicker, essentially trying to assimilate these populations into the broader culture of the United States to eliminate any sort of violence and problems that had existed between Anglo-Americans and Native Americans. Not all of this, of course, was peaceful throughout the 19th century, especially. There were a variety of so-called Indian wars, conflicts between forces of the United States military, things, battles like Little Bighorn, and what we'll talk about here in a little bit, Wounded Knee. Another policy of the federal government was the development of Indian schools. The purpose of Indian schools was to, again, facilitate mainstreaming Native Americans into the larger culture of the United States. The policy was taking Native children. The belief was if we take these children young enough, educate them, acculturate them, it'll assist this process of assimilation. They would take them from the tribes in Indian Territory back to the East Coast, particularly the Northeast, and then hold them in these boarding schools, teach them English, teach them trades, teach them Christianity, other types of values. What happened was, for a while, the policy was in place, and it was not large numbers of people, but it was a problem both for the students that were forced to be there as well as the parents that were left on the reservation. Eventually, in the 1920s, the policy received a lot of criticism and was disbanded. But a lot of those children that eventually grew up into adults and then tried to go back to their families often found themselves marginalized within the tribe. There was this distance between the tribe and these people that had gone to the Indian schools. Other things took place in the 19th century to further complicate the lives of Native Americans. In the Civil War, there were natives that had been slaveholders and had fought for the Confederacy. Certainly there were others that weren't involved in the Civil War at all. But those that had were condemned as traitors and then forced to sell their land. Again, another way to kind of marginalize Native Americans. The final piece, thinking about the 19th century, was the passage of the Dawes Act. The goal of the Dawes Act, again, was this attempt of assimilation. Essentially, it was a call to dissolve tribal lands and then parcel out the land to individual Native Americans. When the tribe members, when the Indians would receive land, they automatically became U.S. citizens, but the assumption was that they would separate from their tribe. And so again, it's trying to distance these bonds, separate Native Americans, and bring them into white society. As you might expect, this kind of approach took a lot or met a lot of resistance, frustration, and that can be seen in a religious movement that develops during the latter part of the 19th century, known as the Ghost Dance movement. The Ghost Dance movement of 1890 essentially is the last indication, the last event of combined intentional militaristic resistance to American expansion. There have been examples of isolated acts of violence in the 1970s, etc., but not any sort of, it's been kind of civil disobedience. destruction of some property, those kind of things, but not kind of military events like what occurs here in the ghost dance. The leader of the ghost dance of 1890 was a man named Wovoka. He was known in white society as Jack Wilson. In his late teen, early adult life, he had worked for a Presbyterian family, and so they referred to him as Jack Wilson. He was a member of the Paiute tribe from Nevada. On January 1st, 1889, he is out cutting wood, but is sick. He's suffering from a high fever and believes that he dies. Right? He kind of passes out. If we were trying to explain this scientifically, we might say he went into a coma. But his claim is that he died from this event. And while he's dead, he sees God. While also having this experience, he sees the Native Americans of long ago, and they are playing the ancient games that the people played. They are engaging in a variety of other ancient ways. He sees the land plentiful of game. Remember, this is late 19th century, so the buffalo are starting to die out from extinction. God tells Wovoka that he is going to send him back. He must tell the people to live good lives, to love each other, to live in peace with the whites, and to not lie or steal. And so, again, the claim is Wovoka comes back to life. Another part of this mission that God is said to have given him was that the people should perform a traditional circle dance. During the performance of this dance, people were expected to see visions. And by performing this dance, the game would return, so would the dead Indians. People would experience visions, and the wicked whites would be removed from the land. So this kind of return to the old ways, return to the old times. Wovoka, the claims are, with it being in the 1890s, there's a lot of information, a lot more information that we have about this incident. But stories pop up that he has control over nature, like he's able to make ice appear in a river in the middle of July. He's able to create thunderstorms and other things like that. So God gives him power over nature, is the claim. God also makes him president of the western part of the United States. Benjamin Harrison is allowed to remain president of the eastern part of the United States, but Wovoka is going to be president in the west. He becomes known in the area around Nevada as the Wanakia, one who makes living. As he starts sharing this message, the belief is he's going to make the past live again. Here, of course, you have this religious resistance to colonization, much like the cattle killing movement. But there are some differences with the ghost dance in that it appears that the ghost dance heavily reflects the influence of Christianity. And so he's kind of developed this kind of hybrid movement. Now, it's unclear whether Wovoka himself explicitly claimed to be the Son of God or not, but there were some who believed him to be Jesus Christ. And he's referred to by people as the Son of the Great Spirit. Others talk about Jesus being reborn as a native. And so there's this idea, the Son of Great Spirit, one part from Christianity. Another part from Christianity is this discussion of the resurrection of dead Indians. Now, Native Americans had views on the afterlife. We talked about that on Tuesday. Some of those views were reincarnation, some were of heaven. They did not, however, have a view of resurrection. And so this is another area where Christianity is having an influence. Like I said, he worked for a Presbyterian family, and so he would have known a lot of things from Christianity. The Christianity he's drawing from, however, is a very apocalyptic Christianity. Right? There's this kind of end times destruction he's prophesying. But it's not entirely anti-white. Right? So he makes a distinction between the Wasichus, who are these kind of evil whites who are trying to take native lands, try to destroy native lands and ways of life. But then there are other whites, like the family he worked for, the family he was associated with, that he felt were good people. But the evil are going to be destroyed as part of this end times event. And then out of that destruction would be a paradise on earth, a heavenly like state, or an Edenic, right, the return of the Garden of Eden, so to speak. And so what we have here that's different than the cattle killing movement is that Wovoka is presenting this combination of some native ideas, things from the past with the Paiute, and then also a connection with Christianity. But the Ghost Dance movement doesn't just stay with the Paiute. Other people begin to hear about the Ghost Dance, and they would come and visit Wovoka to learn the dance and take it back to the tribes. A lot of people, I guess, were thinking that they're hearing this message, they're hearing who Wovoka is supposed to be, and they're thinking, well, we need to take this back because we're having problems as well. Now, it appears that Wovoka's message is a relatively pacifistic one. He's not encouraging violence. He's not encouraging Indians to take up arms against the whites. Now, the whites are going to be destroyed, but the idea is that God's going to take care of that. And he's not saying, grab your guns, grab your bow and arrow, grab any weapon you can and let's go kill some whites. That's not what he's saying. Not everybody who took the Ghost Dance, however, followed the same kind of path. This picture here is of a Lakota ghost shirt. One of the things that I mentioned already was that during this dance, people believed that they experienced visions or saw visions of the dead ancestors. And when the practice made its way to the Lakota Sioux, one of the things that was adopted was, painting your vision on a shirt. And so this is representative of the vision that somebody had while engaged in the ghost dance. The Lakota, however, don't take the pacifistic approach. Instead, it's a very militaristic one. During the dance, or once they put on these shirts after they've made it, the rumor starts going around that the military hears that the natives believe that when they wear these ghost shirts, they are bulletproof. All right. So you can see how the military might be a little suspicious. That these natives practicing this strange new ritual. They're dancing. They're in these ecstatic trances, and now they're claiming these shirts are bulletproof. And so the military becomes very concerned about the Lakota dance and travels to Wounded Knee Creek to see what's going on. Wounded Knee Creek, in November of 1890, a United States agent on the Pine Ridge Reservation sent a telegram to Washington, D.C. that read, quote, "Indians are dancing in the snow and are wild and crazy. We need protection and we need it now." Cavalry and infantry arrived toward the end of November to watch roughly about 3,000 Indians gather. During this time, rather prominent native leader, Sitting Bull, is arrested. He had been very active in the ghost dance at Standing Rock Reservation. When his arrest is ordered, matters get out of hand, and in the midst of a riot that ensues, Sitting Bull is killed. And this, of course, is the Sitting Bull of Custer's Lake Stand. The 7th Cavalry is put under orders to arrest another ghost dance leader named Bigfoot. Yes, leader, Bigfoot. Right? He's located at Wounded Knee Creek, but it appears that the information is faulty. By this time, Bigfoot had given up the ghost dance, but the Army doesn't know this. On the morning of December 29, 1890, the cavalry and other soldiers surround Bigfoot's camp and order the natives inside to give up their weapons. The soldiers then come through the camp to start investigating whether there have been any left. They're searching for guns. A medicine man named Yellowbird is enraged by this, and so he starts dancing. And then reminds the other people that they have the ghost shirts and encourages them to start dancing as well. So there's all of this going on at the same time, right? Searching for the weapons, they're dancing, there's the ghost shirts being talked about. A native named Black Coyote is raising his Winchester rifle over his head. Now, what appears to be the case is that he is saying, I have paid a lot of money for this rifle, I don't want you to take it. But in the midst of all this, a Native American waving a rifle is going to get a lot of attention. Right? So the soldiers surround him, they're trying to get the gun from him, and it goes off. And it's unclear whether he fires it, whether it just kind of accidentally fired it. It's the 19th century. We're not talking about the weapons that are in existence today and the safety. But both sides open fire on each other. Most of the Indians have been disarmed by this point, but there's still exchange of fire on both sides. Out of the 500 that are at the camp, 300 of them are killed. Including women and children. The machine guns were used. Of the 7th Cavalry, 25 were killed and 39 were wounded. Most of those died from rounds from the machine guns. So they were killed by friendly fire. After Wounded Knee, word gets back to Avoca about what had happened to the ghost camps in Wounded Knee. And so he decides to give up the ghost camps. And from that point on, he doesn't publicly talk about the ghost camps. People still think he's a very holy person. They will come to visit him, but he's very secretive, very on the outsides of society. They will send him objects so that he will bless them and return them, for healing or other things like that. So he still has some prominence, but he's largely retreats. And as I said, militaristic resistance kind of collapses after this point. Any questions about the ghost dance or Wounded Knee? Since we're talking about Lakota, let's go back to talking about Black Elk and the Sundance. Black Elk, of course, we talked about some of this on Thursday, but I want to remind us of that. Because on one hand, we have Avoca, who is integrating Christianity into some traditional ways, but it's still meant to be a pan-Indian movement. It's not meant to be a Christian movement. Black Elk is quite different. We mentioned on Tuesday his great vision and how important that was for the rest of his life, that experience. Certainly, we could understand he's reinterpreting it based on different parts of his life, especially as he becomes a Catholic. And so, what is likely to see from Black Elk's life, which has got a lot of attention because of Black Elk's speech, is that he was shaped by his vision. He adopts a Catholic view, but he still participated in a variety of traditional practices as well. we shouldn't kind of let one of these outshine the other. And so people will try to say one or the other. A lot of Catholic priests who've written about Elvis talk about him being Catholic. And they have some good points. He becomes a catechist or a catechizer, meaning that he was teaching other people how to become Catholic or parts about the Catholic religion. But on the other hand, he would participate in pipe ceremonies. One of the other books that he's connected with, lays out some of the traditional religious practices of the Lakota. And so there's a way in which, both of these are a part of his society. But, a lot of Native Americans turn to Christianity. A lot of them either Protestant or Catholic. Before we get to, I wanted to talk about the Sundance, but we'll come back to that. I thought I had the slides in different order. So we have an example of the catechilling movement, new religious response. We have the example of a hybrid form of native religion that incorporates some aspects of Christianity. We have the example of natives or indigenous peoples adopting Christianity but holding on to some traditional practices. When it comes to the experience of the Australian Aborigines, however, it's quite a bit of difference. Again, part of that probably has something to do with the history. Australia starts off as a prison colony. So the people that are on the continent of Australia, the Europeans, are not necessarily the cream of society. It's not the people that you would think that would best represent European society. Instead, they are prisoners. That had an effect on Australian Aborigines. But there was also the intentional elimination of Aborigines by British colonists. It's estimated that today only about 1% of the Australian population is Aboriginal in descent. And so in Australia, there was quite a bit of racial issues, just like what we see in our own history. But essentially, there was the intentional governmental policy to rid Australia of people of Aboriginal descent. Another part of that, so on one hand, you're trying to eliminate or kill them. On the other hand, there were attempts like what took place with Native Americans in the United States of trying to educate people in European values, education, and so you have the existence of the lost generation, sometimes also referred to as the stolen generation, where children were taken from Aboriginal families by the state and were kind of essentially removed from their families. Any sort of rights that they would have had under British law were revoked. And they were, essentially, the attempt was to try and acculturate them. This took place from the 1930s to the 1970s. And similar types of things, that distance between those that went through this process and those that did not, existed there. And so there is that kind of lost generation. You also see among the Aboriginal population, similar to what you see among reservations today in Native America, high levels of alcoholism, with that despair, sometimes poverty. As a lot of traditional society has been damaged or attempts have been made to eliminate. Now let's come back to the Sundance. We're in the midst of talking about the Lakota again. And we talked about on Tuesday the Sundance, its importance among the Lakota. And we talked about relatively simple practice to understand what takes place. but a very difficult one to kind of accept, wrap our heads around as outsiders. We also talked about the classic form of the sun dance prior to colonization appears to have been one that emphasized communal bonds. And even though individual dancers were involved in dancing in the sun dance, the focus was on the community, how the community could physically survive. As the United States, however, made its way through the Lakota lands, eventually they would ban the ghost dance. From 1883 to 1934, the ghost dance was, the sun dance was banned by the United States government. Now, there are two dates here, 1934 and 1952. 1934 is when the Lakota were allowed to practice the sun dance again, but they were not allowed to pierce themselves. It's not until 1952 that ban is lifted as well. Now, I'm sure it's probably not a surprise that even though it's banned by the United States government, it still took place. But with it being illegal by the American government, and there's a lot of attention by the American government, it becomes the practice of a small subgroup. Right? Underground here, not literally underground, but underground in the sense of it's secret. Right? You can't hold this during the day, large gatherings, right? So there's only few people that are willing to practice it, despite it being illegal. With that, a lot of the sun dance during this time moves from it being a communal focus to it being an individual. And so you're not meeting as a community to observe the central ritual of your tribe. People are going off by themselves to practice it as individuals. Probably, the focus is as an individual, I'm resisting this aspect of colonization. Some people have suggested that this might have been part of the reason why the Lakota accepted the ghost dance, but then also were more violent about it in their expression of it. Because here their central religious ritual has been made illegal. And so here's this other religious ritual you hear about that's going to supposedly change all these kinds of situations. It's not a surprise that the Lakota would have latched onto it. Eventually, however, the ban was lifted. Native Americans were allowed to return. The Lakota were allowed to return to practicing the sun dance. Sorry about that. And so we now have a third stage of the sun dance, a revival. In this revival, Black Elk is very, very influential. He's instrumental in writing a book that gets published after Black Elk speaks, called The Sacred Pipe. And the Sacred Pipe is Black Elk telling another anthropologist about the main rituals of all the Lakota Sioux. One of which is the sun dance. But in reading his form of the sun dance, often what Black Elk does is kind of introduce some things or reinterpret some things that are in light of his Christianity, his Catholicism. So, the cottonwood pole tree in the center of the Sun Lodge, essentially Black Elk kind of interprets it as the cross. The blood from the piercings. Sometimes people even offered skin offerings. Women who weren't allowed to participate in the sun dance would cut pieces of themselves. And so all the blood that was a part of the sun dance is understood to be connected with the blood of Christ. And so it's this kind of Christianizing of the sun dance. You also have this return to the communal emphasis. Right? Now the community can again practice the central ritual. But it's different. Previous to the ban, The communal focus was on the physical survival of the community. Famine, warfare, the buffalo, all those things were a part of the Sundance. Now, it's kind of a psychological thing. The American government tried to wipe us out, but we've survived. We are strong. We're going to continue. And so you have more of that psychological survival. Because essentially, you have this kind of restoration that's taking place. But, you have these new generations who haven't really had too much instruction in some of these things. And so a lot of this is shaped by Black Elk and others like him who are kind of paving the way for the next generation. The Sundance is still a very important component of Lakota practice. From about the 1970s on, there was a renewed interest among Native Americans to return back to the traditions of their ancestors. And kind of an extension out of things like the civil rights movement, feminism, other types of movements like that, where people were emphasizing respect for rights and respect for ethnicity, identity, other things like that. Many people, including among the Lakota, thought that one aspect of that identity was important to turn back to the old ways. And so those people that we might call traditionalists still practice the ghost dance, or the Sundance, excuse me. And a lot of that is the focus is on, holding back the tradition. However, there's still a lot of Lakota that are Christian and identify as Christian. They too practice the Sundance, much like the way that Black Elk would have laid it out. However, there's a third group among the Lakota that we might say aren't particularly interested in religion at all, either their traditional religion or the Christian, or Christianity. Their identity is wrapped up in more political types of things, right? So these are the people that are pushing for native rights, pushing for respect, reparations, right? Things that try and make the situation better. They too will practice the Sundance, but it's not as much about any sort of religious connotations. They're doing it because it's a political statement of who they are and how they relate to the larger culture of the United States. Questions about the Sundance? Having a good understanding of these transitions, right, from the classic form to the band form to the revival to the contemporary form would be very good for an exam. So that would be one place to pay attention to. The study guide for the next exam will be up either later today or tomorrow. That won't be until, however, the beginning of April, so we still have some time. After spring break, our focus, the first class is going to be on not necessarily indigenous religions, but religions of China, right? So religions that developed in China. And then we'll talk finally about new religious movements before we break for the third exam. So don't forget the paper due today, as well as the opportunities to catch up on anything that you've missed. Have a good spring break.